Today I'm going to show you how you can replace the CV axle or boot on your car. And before we jack it up and take off the wheel, we got to pop off this hubcap. Then I'm going to go in here with a punch and unstake the axle nut. Then I'm going to use a 30mm 12-point deep socket on my 1/2-inch breaker bar. See if I can break this loose. And we'll gun the axle nut the rest of the way off. And there's the axle nut. I'll just break the lug nuts free. Now I'm going to go ahead and jack the vehicle up. That was not the right spot to jack this up. Now I'm going to remove the wheel. And in behind here you can see where that outer CV boot is leaking. Now in order to get this axle out of here, I need to remove the tie rod and the lower ball joint. Down here at the lower ball joint we got 2 nuts and 1 bolt to remove, and it'll disconnect the lower ball joint at the lower control arm. Well, let's knock it off with the breaker bar first. Okay. Now using the pry bar, I'm going to try to pry off that lower ball joint and the lower control arm there. That'll give me a little bit more room to push the axle out. So now I'm going to get in here at the bottom with my crowbar and try to pop this axle out of the transmission, hopefully not damaging any seals. This might take some struggling, to be honest. Alright, so I got it popped out of the transmission there. Let's see if we can tug it out. And no transmission fluid is leaking. Yeah, so one tip, I was prying with this all the time, but it flexes too much. Get something a lot sturdier, and one pop, it came right out. So here I've got my OEM axle, and I'm going to try to rebuild this with new boots as opposed to getting a new axle. You can see that the axle itself is pretty good, and the damage isn't too bad to the boot. Now I've got this boot kit from Evotech. We've got the outer as well as the inner over here, and it also comes with a clamp as well as the grease inside of there. Now this is definitely going to be a messy job, so you're going to want to wander over to your brother's wardrobe and grab as much clothes as you need. I'm going to start by slowly releasing these clamps. Although we do have new clamps, I'm just going to keep these until the end of the job just to make sure everything fits right. I'll just pop that clamp off. I'm going to pop this inner side out, and of course grease is going to pour out. And here we have the inner part of the CV shaft. Now at the top here there is a snap ring that I need to remove. Alright, so after a little bit of struggling I was able to get the C-clip out. I'm going to save that for later. Alright, next up I'm going to remove the next boot clamp here for the inner CV. There we go. Next up we need to get this inner sliding joint out, and to do that you got to give this a little tap here as if it wants to come out. If not, we might have to use the air hammer. Alright, I'm going to try the gear puller. Got it out. There we go. Next up I'm going to take off the clamp for this balancer piece here. This clamp I have to save because it didn't come in the boot kit. Pop that one out. I have to straighten that back out. So to make this slide out a little easier, I'm going to put some penetrant in there. I worked around with it a little bit and I'm able to get this rubber piece to slide up and down the shaft here. So it should be easier to slide right up and out. One thing I bet you didn't know is that this little tray over here is actually for the straw to be stored while you put this away on the shelf. Now I'm going to start with the outer CV joint clamps here. And then finally I'm going to take off the outer clamp here. So the clamp actually came off with the boot, so I can slide the clamp off and try to save that for later, and then I can take the boot off and drain some of that grease. Looks like this grease is a bit thicker than the last one. Now I'm just going to use this old sweater here to clean up as much as I can. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and disassemble the rest of the CV axle. So we'll pop off the inner boot, slide off this little counterweight thing here. Taking note that the band actually faces the inner side of the inner CV axle. And here we can pop off the outer boot. Slide that down the shaft. There we go. And now I gotta clean everything. My camera's record button is currently full of grease. Anyways, I'll just clean as much as I can off. It doesn't have to be perfect. Now for reassembly, we're gonna change to this much cleaner environment here, such as my cardboard studio. And I'm going to go ahead and just run some brake clean all over these parts to make sure that there's no contaminants on them. If you get some dirt in there, it's just going to aggregate inside of there and cause more problems down the road. Now the OE boot has a little ridge on this axle over here where it locks into, but the aftermarket boot doesn't have that. This has a bit of a high spot. I'm going to try to match it up as closely as I can when I pop this on there. I'm going to be using these CV boot clamp pliers. Let's see if I can clamp this here. It's tight. So one thing that's different between the OE and the aftermarket is that these clamps are exact size while these ones are adjustable, so you got to make sure you put them in the right rung before you squeeze it tight. Here's a close-up of that crimping tool action that you have to use to squeeze this tight. Now I'm going to install the tube of grease that came with the boot set here. Just squirt the whole thing in there. It's going to fling around once the vehicle is rolling, so you don't have to worry about spreading it around in there. Let me know if these things kind of remind you of your wife's side of the family. There is no too much because a CV boot is pretty much a sealed system. So put the whole tube in there. And I'm going to set this boot in there. Make sure it sits nice and snug. Now I'm going to install the included clamp. And as I said before, we have to use like the second rung sometimes, not just the first one. Okay, kind of messy, but whatever. Next I'm going to install the weight. And if you remember, the clamp side was more to the inner, and it sits just over here on this high spot. And I'm going to reinstall the old clamp. Hopefully I can get it to line up. Alright, so I got that clamp on there. It's got to be an easier clamp than this, man. It's stupid. I think one of these has a longer tooth than the other, so you got to know which way you position it. And I got it tight. Next we're going to slide the inner CV boot inside of here. Alright, so that's sitting in the groove. So now I'm going to go in again with the CV pliers. Nice and tight. Now I'm going to clean these little bearings here. Just use a little bit of brake cleaner and a cleaner t-shirt. Well, cleaner than the one you had at least. Now I'm going to install this yoke over here onto the spline shaft, and I'm going to use my mechanical press to tap it in. Now in order to get the tripod past the axle here, I can use my axle socket and then just whack that. Next I'm going to reinstall these little needle bearings here. Give it a little tap here. They just snap right in. Don't forget to reinstall this little circlip over here. Now I'm going to refill the boot with grease. Now just make sure you line up the tripod and the boot with this guy right here. And then we pop that in. I got it all lined up. And I can push the boot up as far as I can. Alright, I got the clamp on there. Push it nice and tight. Finally I'm going to spray everything down just to make sure no excess grease flings over the car. And then you think it's failed again. Also make sure there's no grease and dirt in the ABS toner ring, because you could throw a code. Now I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the axle into the transmission there. Alright, we got it popped in. I can take the outer joint, pop that into the hub at the front here, and push the control arm down, and line up the ball joint at the bottom there. So the two studs are in. I got to drive in the bolt and the two nuts at the lower ball joint. Torque spec on these are nice and tight. I'm going to thread on the axle nut here. Now I'm going to replace the wheel. Torque spec on this is really tight. Now I've got to go in here with a punch and stake the castle nut so it doesn't come loose. Torque spec on the wheels are 80 foot-pounds. And that's how you replace an axle or axle boot on your car. Make sure you subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this one.